The warm afternoon sunlight gleamed off the polished glass facade of Allure, one of Los Angeles's most exclusive luxury boutiques. Inside, the air was cool and fragrant, perfumed with the subtle aroma of leather and fresh flowers. Symphonies from hidden speakers created an atmosphere of elegance. Every detail screamed exclusivity. Elliot stood outside the store, adjusting the brim of his red "Make America Great Again" cap. It wasn't something he wore to make a scene, but a piece of him, a reminder of his roots and beliefs. His plain white polo shirt and faded jeans didn't exactly scream high fashion, but he didn't care. Elliot wasn't here to impress anyone. He had a purpose: to buy the perfect gift for his fiancée. After weeks of saving, skipping lunches, and taking on extra shifts at the warehouse, Elliot had enough to afford something special for Charlotte, a sapphire necklace he'd been eyeing for months. Charlotte was the kind of person who deserved the best. She had stood by him through hard times, never once complaining. This gift was his way of showing her how much she meant to him. With a deep breath, Elliot pushed open the heavy glass door. The faint tinkling of a bell greeted him as he stepped onto the marble floor. Around him were dazzling displays of jewelry, handbags, and clothing. Each item seemed more exquisite than the last, and Elliot couldn't help but pause to admire the craftsmanship of a leather clutch bag. As he wandered further into the store, his fingers brushed lightly over the edge of a jewelry case. He spotted it almost immediately, a delicate sapphire necklace set in white gold. His heart raced as he leaned in closer to admire it. "She's going to love this," he whispered under his breath, picturing Charlotte's reaction when she saw it. But Elliot wasn't the only one who had noticed him. Across the store, Robert Sinclair, the store manager, had been watching. Robert's sharp suit and calculated demeanor gave him an air of authority. He prided himself on running a high-end establishment with an exclusive clientele. As far as he was concerned, Elliot didn't belong. Sinclair narrowed his eyes, taking in Elliot's faded jeans, scuffed sneakers, and the MAGA hat. His lip curled in distaste. In his 3 years as manager of Allure, he dealt with his types before. "Excuse me," Robert said, striding over. His polished shoes clicked against the marble as he stopped in front of Elliot, blocking his view of the necklace. Elliot glanced up, startled. "Oh, hi. Can I get some help with—" "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Robert interrupted, his tone cold. "I'm shopping," Elliot replied, frowning slightly. "I've been saving up to buy something special." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" His gaze flicked to the necklace Elliot had been admiring. "That's one of our most exclusive pieces. Perhaps you'd like to see something more affordable?" Elliot's chest tightened. "No, this is the one. I've done my research. I'm ready to buy it." "Right," Robert said, folding his arms. "Let's not waste each other's time here. I think you know this store caters to a specific clientele. Are you sure this is the right place for you?" Elliot clenched his fists, his face heating. "I'm a paying customer. I've got the money." Robert let out a dry chuckle. "Of course you do. You'll forgive me if I find that hard to believe. We have policies in place to ensure the safety of our merchandise. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable elsewhere." Elliot stared at him, stunned. "What are you saying? That I don't belong here?" "I'm saying," Robert said, stepping closer, his voice a low hiss, "that people like you don't shop here. Now, I'll have to ask you to leave before I call security." The words hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to argue, but something in Robert's expression told him it would be pointless. Around the store, other customers glanced over, their eyes filled with curiosity and judgment. Elliot's shoulders slumped. He wanted to fight back, to demand the respect he deserved, but he knew better. People like Robert didn't change their minds. Without another word, Elliot turned and walked out of the store. Each step felt heavier than the last. As the door closed behind him, a wave of humiliation washed over him, but so did something else, a quiet, burning determination. This wasn't over. Elliot stepped out onto the bustling Los Angeles street, the gleaming storefront behind him a sharp contrast to the weight in his chest. He paused, catching his reflection in the display window. His red hat, once a symbol of confidence and pride, now felt like a target. For a moment he considered tearing it off. But no, he refused to let one man's prejudice dictate how he felt about himself. He pulled out his phone and tapped through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. His finger hovered over the call button for a moment before he pressed it. "Hey, Nate," Elliot said when the call connected. "I need a favor. Are you free this afternoon?" Back inside the store, Robert Sinclair returned to his post behind the counter. He couldn't help but feel a smug sense of satisfaction as he watched Elliot leave. The young man had been a disruption, an eyesore in an otherwise pristine environment. Robert turned his attention back to his duties, rearranging a display of diamond earrings. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice the pair of men who walked through the door a short while later. One of them was Elliot, his posture straighter now, his jaw set. Beside him was Nate, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit that practically screamed wealth. Nate's confidence radiated as he scanned the store, his Rolex glinting under the spotlights. The difference in Nate's reception was immediate. A sales associate hurried over with a bright smile. "Welcome to Allure," she said warmly. "How can I assist you today?" "We're here to see your manager," Nate replied, his voice calm but commanding. Robert appeared moments later, his professional smile in place. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. How can I help you?" Nate didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You can start by apologizing to my friend here." He gestured toward Elliot. Robert's smile faltered as he recognized Elliot. His gaze flickered to Nate, taking in the expensive suit, the watch, the confident demeanor. His expression shifted from dismissal to confusion. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," Robert said. "Oh, you understand perfectly," Nate said, his voice dropping a notch. "My friend here came in earlier to buy a necklace, and you treated him like trash. Care to explain why?" Robert stiffened. "If I recall correctly, your friend didn't appear to be a serious buyer. We have policies in place to ensure." "To ensure what?" Nate interrupted, his voice cutting through Robert's excuse. "That only people you approve of get treated with respect? Or is it just anyone who doesn't look like they belong in your little bubble?" A few customers had paused their browsing to watch the exchange. Robert shifted uncomfortably, his composure starting to crack. "I don't appreciate being accused of discrimination," he said, his tone defensive. Elliot stepped forward. "I don't appreciate being judged because of how I look," he shot back, his voice steady. "I've worked hard to afford that necklace. I came in here ready to buy it. But you didn't even give me a chance." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but Nate cut him off. "Don't bother with excuses. We've heard enough." He pulled out his phone. "You might want to check the store's social media in a few hours. People are going to love hearing how you treat customers here." The color drained from Robert's face. "Now, there's no need for that," he said quickly. "Perhaps we can—" "Can what?" Nate said sharply. "Sweep this under the rug? No. What you did was unacceptable, and people deserve to know." Elliot folded his arms, his confidence bolstered by Nate's presence. "I didn't come back here for the necklace," he said. "I came back to show you that you don't get to decide someone's worth based on a hat, a shirt, or a pair of sneakers. Maybe next time, you'll think twice before judging someone." With that, Elliot and Nate turned and left the store. The door swung shut behind them, leaving Robert standing in stunned silence. Outside, Elliot took a deep breath, the weight in his chest lifting slightly. Nate clapped him on the back. "You did good, man," he said. Elliot smiled. "Thanks for having my back." "Always," Nate replied. "Now, let's figure out how to make this count." Elliot nodded, determination lighting his eyes. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up to prejudice and making sure others wouldn't have to face the same treatment. Elliot didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the scene at the store replayed in his mind. Robert's dismissive tone, the condescending looks, the way he was made to feel small. But Elliot wasn't one to wallow in frustration. He turned his energy into action. By morning, he had a plan. Sitting at the worn wooden desk in his small apartment, Elliot opened his laptop and began drafting a post. His words were clear, precise, and unflinching. He described his experience at the store, how he had been judged and humiliated, and why it mattered. But Elliot didn't stop there. He called for change, urging others to share their own stories of discrimination and hold businesses accountable. "Let's build a world where respect isn't something you have to earn by looking the part," Elliot wrote. He hesitated for a moment before hitting post. Within minutes, the response was overwhelming. Comments flooded in, some sharing similar experiences, others expressing outrage on his behalf. People shared the post, tagging Allure and demanding accountability. Nate called as the post began gaining traction. "Man, have you seen this? Your story's going viral." Elliot leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, I've been watching. I didn't think it would blow up like this." "Well, it has," Nate said, "and you've got a chance to do something big with it. Let's not waste it." Elliot didn't need convincing. He'd already been brainstorming his next steps. "I've been thinking about organizing something, a rally or an event to raise awareness about discrimination in high-end businesses." Nate's voice brightened. "That's perfect. And you know what? We should make it about more than just your experience. Let's focus on creating opportunities for people who've been overlooked or judged unfairly." Elliot smiled, a surge of excitement building in his chest. "Yeah, let's do it." The following week, Elliot and Nate stood in front of a modest stage in a public park, watching as volunteers set up tables and banners. The event, titled Equality Through Action, was taking shape. Elliot couldn't believe the turnout. What had started as a single post had snowballed into a movement. Local business owners, community leaders, and everyday people came together to support the cause. There were booths offering career resources, free resume workshops, and even a donation drive for professional attire. At the center of it all, Elliot stood behind the microphone, his MAGA hat replaced with a simple cap bearing the event's logo. He adjusted the mic and scanned the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," Elliot began, his voice steady despite the nervous energy buzzing inside him. "A week ago, I walked into a store excited to buy a gift. Instead, I was treated like I didn't belong. That experience was humiliating, but it opened my eyes to something bigger. It's not just about one store or one manager. It's about the way we treat each other, the assumptions we make, the judgments we pass. That has to change." The crowd erupted in applause, and Elliot's confidence grew. He spoke about the importance of creating inclusive spaces where people are valued for who they are, not how they look or what they wear. "When we come together," Elliot continued, "we can build something better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's ever been overlooked or underestimated." Nate joined him on stage, introducing a series of guest speakers who shared their own stories. Among them was a local entrepreneur who had faced rejection in her early career because of her appearance. Another was a young man who had been denied jobs despite his qualifications. By the end of the day, the park was alive with energy and hope. People exchanged stories, contacts, and ideas, determined to turn words into action. As the sun set, Nate approached Elliot, handing him a folder. "What's this?" Elliot asked, flipping it open. "It's a proposal," Nate said with a grin. "I've been talking to some people, and they're interested in sponsoring a long-term program, scholarships, job training, that kind of thing. All under your name." Elliot stared at the papers, a lump forming in his throat. "Nate, I don't even know what to say." "Say you're ready to make a difference," Nate replied. Elliot looked out at the crowd, now thinning but still buzzing with conversation and laughter. He nodded, his determination solidifying. "Let's do it." By the next morning, the event had made headlines. News outlets picked up Elliot's story, framing it as a call to action against discrimination. But the part that stuck out the most was how Elliot had turned his personal experience into a movement for change. Back at Allure, Robert Sinclair stood in his office, scrolling through the articles with a sinking feeling. He hadn't just misjudged a customer. He had underestimated a force. Robert Sinclair sat in his office, scrolling through an endless stream of headlines, comments, and social media posts. His heart sank further with each new article that chronicled Elliot's viral story and the successful Equality Through Action event. Luxury store manager sparks nationwide debate on discrimination. How one man's MAGA hat exposed bias in high-end retail. Turning prejudice into progress. The story of Elliot Sanders. Robert's face burned as he clicked on a video of Elliot's speech from the rally. His calm, yet powerful words were now being replayed across platforms, with commentators praising his determination and grace. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Allure's corporate office had called twice that morning, demanding an explanation. The regional manager was scheduled to visit the store in person, a rarity that Robert knew didn't bode well. He stared at his reflection in the office's glass wall, his usual self-assured posture replaced by slumped shoulders. The pride he once felt in his ability to manage an exclusive clientele was now overshadowed by the realization of how his actions had sparked a firestorm. A knock on the office door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Melanie, one of the senior sales associates. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her expression unreadable. "Tell them I'm busy," Robert said automatically. Melanie hesitated. "I think you should come out. It's Elliot Sanders." Robert's stomach twisted. For a moment, he considered refusing, but he knew there was no avoiding this confrontation. He straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the store. Elliot stood near the entrance, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and jeans. He wasn't alone. Nate was there too, along with a cameraman and a reporter holding a microphone. Robert approached cautiously, forcing a polite smile. "Good afternoon," he said stiffly. "Afternoon," Elliot replied. His tone was calm, but there was a quiet strength behind it. Robert gestured toward the seating area. "Perhaps we can speak privately?" Elliot shook his head. "No, I think it's important for this to be public." A few customers had paused their browsing, their curiosity evident as they watched the exchange. "I came back," Elliot began, "not for an apology, but for accountability. Your actions that day weren't just about me. They're part of a bigger problem, one that people like you have the power to change." Robert's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "You looked at me and saw someone who didn't belong," Elliot continued. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't listen. You made a judgment and acted on it. And now, you're facing the consequences." Robert swallowed hard, his professional facade slipping. "I regret how I handled the situation," he said, his voice low. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I'm truly sorry." The reporter stepped forward, her microphone capturing every word. "Mr. Sinclair, what steps will you and Allure take to address these issues moving forward?" Robert hesitated. He hadn't prepared for this. "We're reviewing our training programs," he said finally, "ensuring that all employees receive sensitivity training. What happened to Mr. Sanders was unacceptable, and we're committed to making changes." Elliot studied him for a moment before speaking. "Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Sinclair. I hope you mean what you say, because this isn't just about your store. It's about setting an example for others." With that, Elliot turned to leave, the cameraman and reporter following close behind. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse, whispering among themselves. Robert stood frozen, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't the end of the scrutiny. It was just the beginning. Meanwhile, Elliot's movement continued to grow. Nate helped him establish the Equality Initiative, a nonprofit organization focused on fighting discrimination in workplaces and public spaces. The initiative launched scholarship programs, mentorship opportunities, and workshops for businesses looking to improve their inclusivity practices. Elliot became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story and encouraging others to challenge their biases. One afternoon, while preparing for a panel discussion, Elliot received an unexpected email. It was from Robert Sinclair. The message was brief, but sincere. "Elliot, I've spent the past few months reflecting on my actions. I've enrolled in a diversity and inclusion program and have started volunteering with local community organizations. I wanted to thank you for holding me accountable and for showing me the importance of change. I'm still learning, but I hope to do better. Sincerely, Robert Sinclair." Elliot read the email twice, his emotions a mix of surprise and cautious optimism. He replied with a simple message. "Robert, accountability is the first step. Keep moving forward. Best, Elliot." Months later, Elliot stood on a stage once again, this time accepting an award for his work with the Equality Initiative. As he looked out at the audience, he saw familiar faces. Nate, his fiancée Charlotte, and even Robert Sinclair, who sat quietly in the back. Elliot's voice rang clear as he concluded his speech. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step we take brings us closer to a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. And that's a world worth fighting for." The room erupted in applause, a testament to the impact one man could have when he chose to stand up for what was right. Robert Sinclair stared at the neatly folded volunteer apron in his lap. The words Community Outreach Initiative were printed in bold blue letters. a stark contrast to the luxury branding he had once worn daily. Sitting in the bustling break room of the local community center, he felt more like an outsider than ever before. The air was filled with the sound of children laughing in the adjacent playroom, volunteers chatting as they prepared supplies, and the occasional scrape of chairs against the tiled floor. It was his first day, and he wasn't sure where he fit in. "Mr. Sinclair?" Robert looked up to see a young woman with bright eyes and a clipboard. She smiled warmly. "I'm Rosa. I'll be showing you the ropes today. We're glad to have you on board." Robert managed a small smile. "Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity." Rosa led him through the center, explaining his responsibilities. He'd be organizing donations, assisting with food distribution, and helping families navigate the center's services. It was humbling work, vastly different from managing high-end clientele, but Robert was determined to prove he was serious about changing. By the end of the day, Robert's polished shoes were scuffed, and his shirt was wrinkled from unloading boxes. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. As the weeks passed, he found himself learning more than he ever expected. He heard stories from families struggling to make ends meet, from individuals rebuilding their lives after hardships, and from volunteers who gave their time without expecting anything in return. Slowly, the layers of arrogance he'd once worn began to peel away. One day, while restocking shelves, Robert noticed a familiar face walk through the center's doors: Elliot. Elliot raised an eyebrow when he saw Robert in a volunteer apron, but approached him with a neutral expression. "I didn't expect to see you here," Elliot said, crossing his arms. Robert straightened, meeting Elliot's gaze. "I figured if I was going to talk about change, I needed to start with myself." Elliot studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Change doesn't mean much without action." From that day on, Robert and Elliot occasionally crossed paths at the center. Their conversations were brief at first, but as time passed, they grew more open. Robert often asked for Elliot's perspective on issues he hadn't considered before, and Elliot was willing to share, provided Robert was willing to listen. One afternoon, while organizing supplies, Robert turned to Elliot. "I'd like to help with the Equality Initiative. Do you think there's a place for me?" Elliot hesitated, then nodded. "There's always room for someone willing to put in the work." Elliot's Equality Initiative gained traction far beyond what he had imagined. With Nate's business savvy and Elliot's charisma, they secured funding from local organizations and eventually attracted the attention of national sponsors. The scholarship program launched first, providing financial aid and mentorship for young people pursuing careers in industries that had historically been difficult to access. One recipient, Maya, had dreamed of becoming a jewelry designer, but lacked the resources to attend school. Through the scholarship, she not only completed her degree, but also interned with a renowned designer who was inspired by Elliot's work. At her first showcase, she credited the Equality Initiative for helping her achieve her dream. Another recipient, Jamal, had faced rejection after rejection while trying to find a job after college. With the initiative's mentorship program, he secured a position at a top tech company. Now he volunteers with the program, mentoring others who are just starting out. Elliot often shared these stories at events, reminding audiences that change wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about the lives impacted along the way. Months later, Elliot stood at the podium at yet another event, this one a panel discussion on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Beside him sat Nate, Maya, and, to the surprise of many, Robert Sinclair. Robert adjusted his tie nervously, glancing at the audience. This was the first time he'd spoken publicly about his journey since the incident at Allure. When it was his turn to speak, Robert took a deep breath. "I was wrong," he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "I made assumptions about people based on how they looked, and I treated them unfairly. That day at the store was a wake-up call for me, a painful one, but necessary." He paused, scanning the room. "Thanks to Elliot and the work of the Equality Initiative, I've had the chance to reflect, to learn, and to make amends. I'm not the same person I was, but I know there's still more work to do." The audience applauded, and Robert felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Elliot took the microphone next. "Robert's story is proof that change is possible. It's not easy, and it's not immediate, but it's worth it. This isn't about canceling people. It's about holding them accountable and giving them the chance to grow. Back at the community center, Elliot and Robert shared a quiet moment as the day wound down. "I never thought I'd be working alongside you," Elliot admitted with a small smile. "Neither did I," Robert replied, chuckling softly. "But I'm glad I am. You've taught me more than I ever expected." Elliot glanced at the volunteers and families milling about, the center alive with energy and hope. "It's not about where we start," he said. "It's about where we go from here." Robert nodded, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "Here's to going somewhere better." As the two men shook hands, the room around them buzzed with life, a testament to what could be achieved when people chose understanding over division, action over indifference, and hope over prejudice. 5 years had passed since the day Elliot walked into Allure, ready to buy a gift, and instead found himself at the center of a life-changing moment. The world looked different now. Not because it had become perfect, but because Elliot and countless others like him had refused to accept the status quo. The Equality Initiative had grown from a local nonprofit into a national movement. It now operated in dozens of cities, running mentorship programs, workshops, and outreach efforts that connected communities and industries once thought inaccessible to many. Elliot stood in the headquarters of the initiative, a sleek yet welcoming space that buzzed with activity. Volunteers bustled about, fielding calls, organizing events, and coordinating with partners. A photo wall near the entrance displayed smiling faces of scholarship recipients, alongside testimonials of how the initiative had transformed their lives. As Elliot reviewed a report on their latest outreach program, Nate walked in, holding a cup of coffee in each hand. "Morning, boss," Nate said, setting one cup down on Elliot's desk. "You're here early," Elliot replied, taking a sip. "Big day," Nate said, grinning. "Don't forget, you're the keynote speaker at the Change Makers Summit this afternoon." Elliot chuckled. "How could I forget? You've only reminded me 10 times this week." Nate leaned against the desk, his grin softening. "You've come a long way, Elliot. From that kid who walked out of Allure with his head down to someone who's changing lives every single day." Elliot nodded thoughtfully. "I still think about that day sometimes. How different things could have been if I had just walked away and done nothing. But you didn't," Nate said. "And because of that, a lot of people have hope where they didn't before." Later that afternoon, Elliot took the stage at the Change Makers Summit. The audience, a mix of community leaders, corporate executives, and activists, erupted into applause as he approached the podium. "Thank you," Elliot began, his voice steady and warm. "5 years ago, I stood in a store and was told I didn't belong. That moment was painful, but it also opened my eyes to the power of action. Today, I stand before you not as someone who overcame injustice alone, but as part of a movement that has brought countless people together to create meaningful change." He shared stories of lives impacted by the Equality Initiative. A single mother who had started her own business after receiving mentorship and funding. A high school student who became the first in their family to attend college, supported by the Initiative Scholarship Program. A former retail worker who now led diversity training sessions in major corporations, reshaping workplace culture. These stories, Elliot said, his voice filled with emotion, remind us that change doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we lift each other up, when we challenge systems that divide us, and when we choose to believe in the potential of every individual. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation as Elliot stepped back from the podium, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. That evening, Elliot returned home to find Charlotte waiting for him on the porch. The sapphire necklace she now wore every day sparkled faintly in the moonlight. "How was the summit?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him. "Unbelievable," Elliot replied, pulling her close. "But honestly, I'm just glad to be home." They sat together under the stars, the quiet hum of the city their only background noise. "Do you ever think about where we'd be if that day hadn't happened?" Charlotte asked softly. "All the time," Elliot admitted. "And I remind myself that it wasn't just about what happened, it was about what I chose to do after." Charlotte smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, you know." Elliot glanced down at the necklace. "You were the reason I walked into that store in the first place. This journey started with you." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past and the promise of the future mingling in the cool night air. Across the city, Robert Sinclair was finishing his day at a different kind of workplace. As the director of the local community center, he now spent his days coordinating programs for underserved families and mentoring young people trying to find their way. He had long since shed the suit and tie, trading them for a practical shirt and jeans that better suited his hands-on role. The walls of his modest office were lined with photos of volunteers and families he'd worked with, each one a reminder of the life he had built after his fall from grace. As he locked up for the night, he glanced at a flyer pinned to the bulletin board. It was for an upcoming Equality Initiative workshop. Elliot's face was on the flyer, smiling confidently. Robert smiled to himself, a sense of peace settling over him. He knew he'd never fully atone for his past mistakes, but he had learned to live in a way that honored the second chance he'd been given. As he stepped out into the cool night, he thought of Elliot's words. "It's not about where we start, it's about where we go from here." And for the first time in years, Robert felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.